All right, guys, so we are going to look at the significance test or overview for inference here. So this is meant to be used as a resource as we begin to and continue reviewing for the AP test. So at this point, we have 9 different significance tests that we've discussed, and all except for the chi-square test also have confidence intervals that go with them. So this is a lot to kind of organize, and really we want to focus on how do we know when to use which test. So this tool will help us figure out when to use which test and also what the steps are that go along with each of those tests. So you should have a blank chart kind of like this where there are 9 different spaces for the tests, and it's just got everything that goes along with each one of them. So what I'm going to do is I want to just walk you through one of them so you can kind of see how this works, and then you guys can go from there. So the first one I'm going to do is just a one sample z-test for proportion. So this is the very first test that we did way back in section 9.2, I believe. All right, so that's my test name, a one sample z-test for a proportion. Next up, and this may be the most important part here, is how do I know when to use this test? So for this test, I use it when I have one sample or population that I'm looking at. And when I'm comparing a proportion or a percent or a rate to a known or a given value. So they may say, they may come right out and say the word proportion. They may say, 57% of Americans, blah, 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 or 43 out of 800 people, blah, 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 blah. And that would be more like the rate. And we're comparing this to a specific value. So one population, say we want to know is 10% of the population left-handed, something like that. Okay, so the parameters then. So now we kind of talk about what those test steps look like specifically for each test. So parameter, or this one only has one parameter. So it's just the proportion of what? What is it that you're measuring? We move on to the hypotheses. So the hypotheses take this form. So my null hypothesis is always p equals some number, p equals 0.1, p equals 0.43. And my alternative is then I would pick one of these. P is less than, greater than, or not equal to that same number. Okay, from there we move on to verifying our conditions. So this test has 2 conditions. The first one is some sort of randomness. So this is either achieved by an SRS, or they say the sample is random, or sometimes in an experiment we see that treatments were randomly assigned. And then our normality condition, we're looking at n times p and n times 1 minus p, and those both have to be greater than or equal to 10. This little p sub 0 is just telling you it's the proportion that goes with the null hypothesis. So it's not your p hat from the sample, it's the p that you're comparing to. All right, next up then, so kind of some of the, that next big chunk of actually running the test. So the test statistic for this test is a z. This is just saying next we would find the p-value. This is also a good spot to put how you find degrees of freedom if that applies. So this particular test does not have a degrees of freedom, so we just cross it off. Some tests have it, some tests don't. And I also think this is a good spot to say what it's called in the calculator. So the calculator command for this is a one prop z test. So this is just kind of your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about this test. The last thing I have then is the interpretation or conclusion. Okay, so since our p-value is, and I used yellow for the scenario where our p-value is less than our alpha, and blue for the scenario where it's greater. So if it's less than, here you would write your p-value in, alpha equals whatever it is for that problem. We reject HO. We have convincing evidence that the proportion of whatever you're measuring is, you talk about what HA is. And then in blue, it talks about what you do if it's greater than. So kind of just, in whichever applies to your scenario based on what your p-value and alpha are. Okay, so this is what you're going to be doing for each of the 9 tests on the next slide here. So I have all of the tests and I have all of the sections that go with each of them. So this first one is done. We just did that one together. It doesn't matter what order you do these in. You just want to make sure you get all 9 of them. So after you guys have a chance to look at this, work through this, I will share the key with you, but I want you to try it on your own first and see if you can, this is really for you to refresh your memory on some of these tests and inference procedures we haven't looked at in a while.